Hello, I'm Soycat and welcome back to the second channel geography video, except wait, it's a history video because I'm here in person in Singapore because I wanted to follow up on some of the comments from the city-state video, because in that video a lot of people were kind of confused by the idea that there really are countries that do both function as a city and a country, or rather that there are countries out there with just one city and that's it. And I figured because of that I would actually come here to Singapore, the world's most successful city-state, in fact one of the only like 2 or 3 you can really even call that in the modern age, and talk about how a place like that, I want to talk about history of it because that's a fascinating way to explain this particular example, but to then explain exactly how a city-state can only exist in the modern day 2018, but also how it, how it survives and manages not be invaded and manages to like sustain itself, but also how it manages to thrive and be, depending on how you want to measure it, depending on all the different categories, usually one of the top 5 countries in the world for pretty much everything: living standards, income, in terms of like education, all these things. It's in like the top of the world. Passport is ranked like the second in the world. How does this happen to a country of just a single city? Well, that's something I want to explain in today's video. So let's start by actually explaining the name origin of this place. I think name origin stories are usually boring and worth skipping for most countries, like Deutschland, land of the Deutsch, how very clever. But no, in the case of Singapore, I really love the origin story because it's so bad it loops right back around and becomes good again. So if you're curious as to what I mean by that, let's go for a walk, by the way. It's super hot, but whatever. If you're curious what I mean by that, basically the way this place got a name is that the first half of the last millennium, like 600-700 years ago, when they first settled here, or the first like modern settlement of about 1,000 people at least, they decided, the local Malay ruler from northern day Malaysia decided that he would name the place after something he saw in the jungle, because he had to name it something, and he thought he saw while he was hunting a lion. I want to stress thought he saw because we know for a fact, historically speaking, there were never lions on this place, but he decided, let's name the thing Lion City. So that translates in Sanskrit to Singapore, and then anglicized later to Singapore. So the name origin of this place is because one guy a long time ago thought he saw a lion, definitely didn't see a lion, I don't know, I love that personally. It's just a little bit of backstory. As it turns out, there's some like refuting to that today, but that's the widely known story, at least in Singapore. And basically I wanted to talk about the actual history from about 1819 onwards, because although it did exist before that, it was a port, it was a mildly successful port. Again, it only had a population, the whole island had a population measured in the thousands, and it's not really too much. But in 1819 all of that changed, because over the few hundred years between, again, when it was first called Lion City or Singapore, and between 1819, there was some European efforts in the area, particularly by the Dutch and the Portuguese, but it mostly got like really started in 1819 when Mr. Stamford Raffles, essentially that name, it's like kind of funny and that's why I like to mention it, but also a lot of stuff here is named after him. But he came over here, and like even the nearest metro station to me is called Raffles Place. But basically he came over here and he decided like to buy the port, I guess the entire island, off the local Malay rulers for some absurdly low yearly payment. However, unlike the mistake they made with Hong Kong of making it a 99-year lease, it was actually leased in perpetuity to the British. So the British bought this island permanently, and it became a part of the empire essentially back in 1819. And from then onwards things got really crazy because he decided to turn it into a free port. If you're curious as to why the British would have an interest in a random Southeast Asian island when they didn't have, why would you even want that? Like, that was something I had curious. Like, I've always been curious as to why Singapore was the center of so much trade, because that is something they do really great today. But how did that even start? Why did the tradition in the first place? And the simple explanation of why they wanted a port here is because it's really conveniently placed on the route between India and China. Both, again, great places for trade at the time, great places for trade even to this day. Also, that makes it a great in-between spot between Australia and both of those places, and also that means it's a great place between any European country and then any of those 3 places. So essentially it makes it not quite a global hub for trade because the Americas aren't necessarily linked in there, but a pretty much global, like a Afro-Eurasian Australian hub for trade, which is a pretty big deal. So they wanted a port for that reason and decided to make it a free port for the whole idea of being, let's get as much trade going as possible. In case you're curious, at the time, and even to this day, like 2018, there's still a lot of like duties, tariffs, taxes to be paid, import taxes, etc., to trade something somewhere. But the free port of Singapore had the selling point of having no taxes, no duties whatsoever. So people could come here on their little journeys and they could trade, and because of that, they made a very vibrant, very successful port town. Again, as part of the British Empire, the port town eventually became a port city because it developed so fast north because of that. Again, it was a convenient location and it was a free port, so it developed massively from having about 1,000 people. Again, it was measured in the thousands at the very least when it was first taken in 1819, to about 100 years later, 120 years later, I think it was exactly, they reached 1 million people. So that's 1,000 times growth in a century. And to get all of that growth, in case you're curious, and this is a key part of the why, one of the weird facts about this place, that it has an ethnic Chinese majority, the only place outside of China, to actually have that be true, is because they need to import a lot of labor to make that happen. And even though the native people here are Malays, if I'm not mistaken, the British at the time, it's one of these weird facts of history. It's like, you can really just have that as a view, but they thought the Malays were lazy, which my Singaporean subscriber tells me is because they usually owned land, which meant they were less motivated than immigrant labor, which is just like obviously there to work. That's true even to this day, right? But yeah, so they needed to migrate a lot of people here, and they took a lot of Chinese and a lot of Indians. Not so much Indians, like they're only a minority, like 7 or 8%, but they took a lot of Chinese people, or encouraged a lot of Chinese people to come here. Saying take makes it imply like, taking the slaves, but they encouraged a lot of Chinese people to come here to build the port city of Singapore, which then again it grew massively, becoming one of the jewels in the British Empire. So when did that all change? Because you might notice that Singapore is its own country and not one of the weird extremities of the UK or an overseas territory. So the way that changed, the time that changed, I guess, is because of the World War. So the British Empire in 1800s, the 19th century, was the world power. Like, how today you had like in the US and you have China now, and you used to have the US and Russia. Back in the 1800s, it was just the UK, Pax Britannia, Rule Britannia, Britannia of the world, the world's largest empire that's ever been. It's a little thing a little bit proud of, right? But no, most certainly, there was just the British Empire, so it was a really safe place. It was one of the jewels in the British Empire. It's like you come here and it's safe, because again, you're part of the world's greatest power. So people around here were pretty pro-British because of that. Like, oh, well, it means we're safe and we get to keep doing our business and it's wildly successful here. So that works out pretty well. But because the World Wars was the first time that the way that the British Empire had stayed on top was by kind of staying out of conflicts, by just having a good navy. But World War I was the first time that it was really tested. The finances were stretched, and it meant that having both a Pacific fleet and having a European fleet at the same time was kind of impractical. So instead, what they tried to do between the World Wars is they built Singapore, the place I'm in right now, into just the mega fortress, the fortress of the East, whatever you want to call it, one of the big strongholds of basically the entire British Empire outside of Europe. That was the whole, or at least in the East. Again, we were excluding the Americas. Let's just pretend they don't exist for this video. So basically, they decided to turn it into a fortress so they could keep their entire Eastern Empire safe. And they did that by making it essentially impossible to invade from the south, because the threat in the region was Japan mostly, and Japan, to get to Singapore, they would have to go through like 5 other countries from the north, realistically, to do it, or they would have to go through the south. So they fortified the south like crazy. They made it so that they could get their European fleet to here in, I think it was like 39 days or something. It later turned into like 6 months, but they could get their entire fleet here if they needed to, and they made it so that if as well as being able to get their fleet here, they had like a bunch of technology, as well as having just non-stop artillery cannons along the south of the island, and they made the island possible to invade from the south, as well as pretty easy to fortify and upgrade. And again, it was the fortress in the British Empire. However, one key mistake was made, and that was not realizing that Japan would be able to go through those 5 countries up north. So to put it like, there's a long series of countries, but the Japanese very quickly, like in amazing speed, I guess, during World War II, they took French Indochina, basically Vietnam and a few other countries. They took Burma, or Myanmar, whatever you want to call it. They took British Malaya, which is nowadays Malaysia essentially, and then from there they were able to launch an assault on Singapore. Again, the fortress in the east, the key, one of the key parts of the British Empire, one of the richest parts of the world, which had to stay fortified because of its economic significance, because of its defense significance, and because of a billion other reasons. So even though there were over 100,000 soldiers stationed here, even though they had all these guns, fighting from the north was not something they had any experience or any real idea on how to do. So yeah, because of that, the British, long story short, is they lost the war in one of the big, Winston Churchill, because he wrote a bunch of letters saying like, fight to the, this is, without this, it's gone, it's all over. But, you know, essentially, looking back in history, we can say they surrendered too early. At the time, they were just like, we lost our water supply, we lost our, you know, it seemed like they were facing insurmountable odds. But we now know to this, like right now, that they essentially were outnumbering the Japanese 3-1, but still surrendered to them unconditionally. And it's known as the greatest capitulation in history, according to Winston Churchill, who was very unhappy about it, as you can imagine, being Prime Minister of what was the world's largest power, and then having one of your key fortifications, your key things, just kind of surrendered to the Japanese like all of a sudden. It was a big humiliation for the British, basically, is what I'm trying to get across here. And because of that, it led to really the end of the British Empire, slowly, at least in the East, because in Australia they were getting bombed by the Japanese, and British couldn't do anything because they didn't have a foothold to really defend them from. So yeah, essentially that's why, you know, Australia and New Zealand are now like slightly more US aligned than they are UK aligned, for instance, and all of the other countries in the area wanted their independence. So they slowly started getting their independence. The empire slowly started to end bit by bit, and that happened in Singapore. And about 1959 is when they got true self-governance, as like just like direct, essentially, but the real part begins in 1963 because they decide to join Malaysia. The demographics of Malaysia and the demographics of of Singapore are vaguely similar, except the split is reversed. So in Singapore, it's got about 75% of people being Chinese, about just under 20% of people being Malaysian, and just under 10% of people being Indian. Whereas in Malaysia, it's the same, but with Malaysia and China being reversed. So because of the, I guess, essentially ethnic tensions, but I guess a lot of divisions in exactly how they'd organize it, they had issues setting up together, and it was, even though it was something both sides really wanted, I guess Singapore wanted more because they're just a city, they really wanted to be a part of Malaysia, but the long story short, the TLDR, is that they could not sustain being in the Malaysian Union. And it's one of these crazy stories of history where it's the only time in modern history at the very least where, because most countries had to fight for their independence, they had freedom fighters and wars and deaths and bloods and, you know, independence squares and all these things. Like, fighting for independence is a thing that most countries fought tooth and nail for. But it's weird because in the case of Singapore, just 2 years after they joined in Malaysia, they were essentially kicked out. I think that's the shortest story. Like, you can use more diplomatic words, but they were kicked out of the Malaysian Federation. So Malaya went into Malaysia to have Singapore and a few other bits join, and then they kicked out Singapore 2 years later in a secret vote held without, you know, Singapore's representatives to the parliament being there. They were all like, so should we kick out Singapore? Oh, Singapore's not here to vote, but everyone else says we should, so I guess goodbye Singapore, your own country now. So they just all wake up and they're like, well, I guess we're independent now, isn't that wonderful? So yeah, Singapore became independent against their wishes. They're one of the few examples of a country of being kicked out. Imagine just like, you know, the US states getting together and being like, we're sorry, North Dakota, but you're going on your own now. Or like, I like to picture like the English, countries being like, you know what, Scotland, you've had your good run now, but you're gone now. And they're like, please, can we? I don't know. Like, you can picture that with like any country just being like, go away now, please. But that happened with Singapore, and then it became an independent country in 1965, which is crazy because that means the country, as of now, is only 52 years old, about 53 years old. So the country is younger than most people, or a lot of people, not most, a significant number of people that live in it. So yeah, that's how Singapore came to be. It's a city-state. That's how it like started to exist, but that's not where the history ends, because the thing about having a city-sized country, you might think like, oh, that's the end of it. But the truth is when the country first came about, when they were kicked out, it was internationally just assumed, widely believed, that the country would fail. Like, there is no way a country as a city-state can succeed, right? Because what are you going to do? Like, you're a city. How are you going to defend yourself? How are you going to keep resources? They don't. There was a billion questions about it, and it was just, again, widely assumed that it wasn't a matter of when it would fail. If it would fail, it was a matter of when Singapore would fail. However, the man who was the technical prime minister of the country, because he was the leader of the party and the leader of the local part of Singapore, then became the prime minister of Singapore. And it's crazy because it's one of these examples of like one man defining history, like one man changing history, I guess. Because this one guy, this Lee, let's call him for short, because long name, don't want to do the pronunciation thing where people are like, well, good video, but you mispronounced that, so 1 out of 5, worst thing ever. But yeah, so long story short, a guy named Lee gets into power because he's the prime minister, because he was the largest party member, etc. And he was like when they got independent, he cries on TV. Like his whole life, he believed in a Britain and Malaysia, and I never believed that someone would cry because they got kicked out of the Federation. But yeah, like you can see it on TV. He's doing an interview to explain what the heck just happened to Singapore, and he's like, my whole life I believed in Singapore, and then he cries a little bit, like he has to tell the cameras to stop, and then he comes back and he's like, we will do this, we will become a Singapore, because the crazy thing, it's not just that they had to be a city-state country, one of the few in the modern world that was large, etc. They also had to come to the fact that they were like so ethnically divided, like I said, 70, 20, 10 between different people. How do you start a country like that? And the long story short is he went away for 3 weeks. As soon as he became Prime Minister, he vanished for 3 weeks. Again, it's one of these things where it's like, it sounds like a mythological mythological leader from way back when, but no, real person from real past, just 50 years ago. He vanishes for 3 weeks, like the country needs him, but he's like, I'm just gonna, inconsolable, wouldn't speak to anyone for 3 weeks, and then he comes out 3 weeks later and he's like, here's the plan, let's do this. So the basic plan, there's so many steps to it, essentially. Most political leaders that have ever met him have described him as like understanding how to play the game of chess and political maneuvering and stuff. Essentially, the long story short and exactly how he did it was making, I guess, I was going to say the simple explanation is like, make Singapore great again, but essentially do all the things that made Singapore great before and try to remain, okay, so I guess step by step, let's go through one by one. So to make a Singapore a successful, rich, etc. country, the plan was, step one, defend itself. It was, just left Malaysia, which meant that there was some, I don't know what the word would be, some hostilities, but not quite, and from the north. And Indonesia at the time was very, very not okay with what was going on there. I'm not entirely certain on the conflict, but basically they were stuck between two neighbors that didn't want them. They're one of the more unstable or hostile regions of the world, so they immediately started investing in defense. There's national conscription still to this day. It's actually the reason you can't be a Jehovah's Witness here. Like, instead of just being like, oh yeah, well, they just don't let you be a Jehovah's Witness. There's a lot of, I want to get into that later, but let's just, so there's still national conscription to this day, fun little fact. There, and they spend like a ridiculous percent of their money on the military. They're one of the best ranked militaries in the world because, again, if you're just an island, you're just a small island, you gotta defend it because people are gonna think like, wouldn't it be easy if I could take that? No, it wouldn't be easy to take Singapore. So if any of you out there are considering invading Singapore, pro tip, do not. So the second thing is the economy. So like I said before, trying to, it was widely most countries have the idea of like, let's be self-sufficient, but Singapore just goes full on the idea of internationalism, globalism, trade, etc. And so the whole goals of the administration were like, make Singapore the place to do business. Like, if you're going anywhere outside your own country, it should be Singapore. So the TLDR again on this one, I want to like skip the political section where you're like, oh, but that wouldn't be a good idea here. But no, essentially low taxes across the board. I don't know the exact rates, but I know for corporate tax it's 17%, which is lower than average. I know the sales tax is 7%, significantly lower than average, especially if you're from Europe, right? But yeah, essentially low taxes across the board. Try to make the port to go to. So again, super low, kept the low duties kind of thing. The port of Singapore is now the biggest in the world, if I'm not mistaken, or most visited. I mean, size, obviously, when you've got an island is hard. The airport, Changi Airport, is not only ranked the best airport in the world consistently, but it's also one of the busiest by international traffic, because again, they made government Singapore Airlines, which was like the luxury airline as well as the business airline, etc. So yeah, by having all of these things together, kind of like combining the idea of, I don't know where I've been walking, by the way, but by combining the idea of, making it the easy place to get to, because the airport was so easy, the port was so easy, the tax rates are so incentive. They try to incentivize in every single way any foreign companies come in, which is the opposite of how every other country has been doing things, right? Where it's like, oh, yeah, I really hate, we should make all our own stuff and not really do trade with those other countries, and immigration's bad. No, like, not quite open to immigration, but there is an absurd amount of immigrant growth in the country. There is an absurd amount of free trade going on, and it took the country, the famous quote is like, from third world to first world in a generation. From 1965, when, again, the Prime Minister at the time, Lee, who was in power for 30 years, again, there's lots of questionable things, but we'll get into that second. From when he took power to just over 30 years later, the GDP, just over 30 years, the GDP went from $1,000 per person to 30,000. There is consistent growth rates of 6 to 8% every single year, because all of those things they decide to do, focusing on human capital. They don't have many resources, but they have people, so they educate them like crazy. In English, by the way, which makes it, again, even easier to do international business here. Every single thing about the country is oriented about taking advantage of the two things that Singapore has, which is a perfect location for trade and you know, a small group of people, but you know, like having the English thing, having the well-educated thing, makes Singapore the best place to do business for so many firms. There are so many multinationals here. I don't know the number of, I think it's over 10,000. There are so many people just come here to do a little bit of business because it's like the headquarter place for the you know, Asia. Like if you want to start a business and you know, it's just the easiest place to start your you know, Asian headquarters. So they come here to do it because you get so expertise about how to do things. Basically, my point of all of this is Singapore became the place to do business because of all of the various policies they made the country. Again, there's lots of like weird things in here. It's like that might sound like, oh, so the pro tip is you need free trade and low taxes. Wow, right-wing tweak out here, right? But also he focused on you know, building social housing. That's right, social housing. 80% of the country lives in social housing, if I'm not mistaken, which has a bunch of weird rules like the quota. Which races, like you have to have a certain percent which match the country living in each housing unit, which is weird apparently. The transit is absurdly cheap and everywhere. I mean, because it's an island, again, I love that because it's a city-state, it means that you can just have like, there's no such thing as like a normal train. It's all metro, the whole country connected by one metro rail, or MRT I believe it's called. But my point being is the entire country is so accessible. The entire country is livable, and basically my point being is Singapore went from being a you know, a country which everyone thought would fail to being the example of a country which is successful, because now in, you know, 2018 it is, depending on how you want to measure it, by, you know, like GDP per person, in the top 5, again usually free, by passport you know, freedom, by the number of countries that have visa-free agreements, it's in the top 5, 4 or 2, or sometimes 1, because they have some good agreements with North Korea, for instance. Basically, Singapore is everyone's friend. Singapore is the place to do business, and Singapore, besides being not physically quite cool, because you might have noticed it's really hot here, or I don't know if you can notice that from video, but trust me when I say it is, Singapore is just pretty darn cool. Anyway, but before I go though, I want to mention just a few things which I found odd that really made me question, I guess, your worldview, because again, there's a lot of authoritarian stuff that had to be done to take Singapore, again, from that like smaller country to like the growth rates it has today, and a lot of them make me uncomfortable, I guess, but somehow they worked out anyway, and they make me go like, oh, I guess if that works out, maybe that's okay. So for instance, there's a lot of like, there's fines for everything in Singapore, and although they're less done nowadays, there's a lot of weird stuff like, oh yeah, you cannot have gum in this country. If you want to get gum, you have, like, it's banned. You have to either bring it in from overseas, or you have to go to a dentist or a pharmacy, and they literally and which has to be for like a specific condition, and they write down your name and you're like registered. Like essentially gum is treated the same way guns are in some countries. Drug traffickers, or like if you have a certain amount of drugs which is really low, it's not that there's just serious penalties. They kill you. You're hung. I believe it's like the following Monday too, which is like, that's like some medieval stuff. But I mean, the country has no drugs and no guns, and no gum is found on the floor, and people don't litter too. So there's a lot of really, really, I guess, uncomfortable authoritarian stuff here that somehow has worked out to make the place slightly nicer for everyone. And also it makes you question a lot of the things which I guess I already questioned, and now this is like my proof point with stuff like, okay, so if in countries which do have rural areas, again, this is one huge urban conglomeration, which is one of the reasons it's so successful, it makes you question, for instance, the whole idea of agricultural subsidies. Everyone says, oh, we need agricultural subsidies because, like, well, I mean, if there's a war, well, we need to get our food supply, while still not quite getting all of your food supply. You know, and it makes the food more expensive at home, which you subsidize with taxpayer money, and then, and my point being, is every country pays an absurd amount of money, usually to rich landowners, because we need the food security, right? Here, as you can imagine, there isn't land to do that, so they don't do that at all. They import everything, and it works out really well for them. And it makes you question, like, well, I mean, like, oh, they're not safe from any wars, though. What wars are they not safe from? And even if there was a war, I mean, they're not safe for a billion other reasons too, right? I don't know, it's one of those things that makes you question that. Basically, Singapore is the exception country that was somehow made, and I'm just saying, they made Singapore great again. And maybe there's some lessons to be learned here. And I feel like every country is learning from here. China even is jealous of Singapore. Like, if you look into it, they're trying to emulate. That's where a lot of their special economic zones, like Shenzhen, if I'm not mistaken, the idea for all these things come from Singapore, because free trade works pretty well, as it turns out, and it leads to a small fishing village called Singapura just 200 years ago with less than 1,000 people, to the almost 5 million megapolis, which is one of the most successful, one of the most rich, one of the best countries in the world in just 200 years. And who knows where we'll go in 200 more years, but I do think there's some lessons to be learned from this. But again, makes me a bit uncomfortable. Also, the thing that makes me really okay, I just want to mention this again. So one of the key things is in managing to have a successful economy is they have pretty much no room for populism in the country, because the campaigning period is 9 days. The boundary changes, they're essentially done in favor of the ruling party, but like they get such a high percentage it doesn't matter. And I was really suspicious of that. But again, I met some Singaporean subscribers and they all said, like, actually, yeah, we think the government's done a really good job for 50 years. That's why we vote for them. It's not like a Russia and Putin thing where you have to be kind of suspicious about what's going on there. It seems like, yeah, they just think the government's done well. And to be fair, the government has seemingly done quite well. Again, like 30, 40 times rise in living standards in just 50 years. And anyway, I like Singapore a lot. It's crazy hot here. There's a billion things I love to talk about, like the temperature, for instance. It's like pretty much the same every day, or every hour of every day of every year. The lowest recorded temperature was like 19 and the highest was like 36. That's the range of like lowest ever to highest ever. But anyway, I hope you all enjoyed it. Let me know what you think, comments down below. And I guess I have to go see Monaco now, to see the difference, because I think Singapore's a better example of a city-state, but I kind of want to see Monaco just for like the comparison. Anyway, second channel, don't care. Well, I mean, I care a little bit. I mean, I'll be honest, that's why I came to Singapore, just to see something. But anyway, just to, check it out for all of you. But second channel, care a little bit. Goodbye.